Hey guys, Tad here with Kiss Organics. I wanted to share this talk because I get a lot of questions about what inputs are safe to use in your garden. And I hear a lot of talk about this on social media, online, as well as in other groups. So this is a talk I put together for the Living Soil Summit this year in Pahrump, Nevada, and I wanted to re-record it here to share on YouTube. So the question I was looking at is what inputs are safe to use in your garden? There's a lot that goes into what products you choose to use to grow your plants with, and it's important to be thoughtful about those choices. So let's start by looking at some common agricultural fertilizers. The industrial meat industry is awful, and there's no denying that. These animals are fed GMO grains and antibiotics or crops that have been sprayed with glyphosate, which is also Roundup. Therefore, these fertilizers will be contaminated with GMOs and antibiotics and pesticides, and you're contaminating your crop when you use these inputs. In fact, blood meal, bone meal, and feather meal are not truly organic. One could even say they're fake organic because they come from the waste streams of our industrial meat supply chain. So, what are the alternatives? Amendments like fish bone meal or fish meal are much better because they're from the ocean. If you have a good source like wild caught fish, then you are utilizing cleaner amendments in your garden, and you're not supporting the horrible meat industry, and you're doing better by the environment. It's an all-around win. Now, that's a really compelling argument right there. It aligns with my values as someone who cares about organics and the environment. But what I want to do today is take a deeper look at these claims and see what research exists to either support or refute this idea. Let's talk about the conditions under which animals are raised in the meat industry. To be honest, they're not great. This to me is the best argument for not using these inputs. However, I also look at it from a sustainability perspective. If we know that these fertilizers are safe, that they're low in heavy metals, that they do not contain GMOs or pesticides, and are very affordable, then it makes sense to me to be closing the loop. As realistically, they're not going anywhere, whether these waste products end up in compost, fertilizer, or even a landfill. And I know many folks in the room are into biomimicry, essentially doing what they think Mother Nature might do. And I can't think of anything more natural or a higher use than using a dead body to recycle the nutrients to grow something new. So, what about the fishing industry? Is it superior to the meat industry? Well, most folks are familiar with the issues associated with farm fish. Farm fish are raised in high density conditions similar to the meat industry. Farm fish have a higher rate of disease and can be higher in contaminants due to their diets. They make up more than half of the fish consumption within the United States. Between 70 and 80% of the seafood consumed in the United States is actually imported. But this is a bit of a misleading statistic because a portion of it is caught by American fishermen, exported overseas for processing, and then re-imported back into the US. And they use open net cages that can leach chemicals into the ocean, putting ocean wildlife at risk and damaging ecosystems. And farm fish have been known to escape their pens, which can spread disease to native populations because farm fish are regularly fed antibiotics because of their greater propensity for disease and parasites. Many farm fish are genetically modified as well and can contaminate native populations, like I mentioned above, and their waste can produce phytoplankton blooms, which destroy local ecology. So we can safely say that farm fish are not a reasonable alternative to the meat industry. So what about wild caught fish then? It's estimated that 80% of the world's natural fish stocks are fully overexploited, depleted, or in a state of collapse. Bycatch is a term referring to the unwanted fish or other marine creatures that are caught by commercial fishing practices. Sometimes the amount of bycatch that is captured, killed, and discarded can be as high as 80% for certain fisheries. So this is something like if they are fishing for a particular fish species like salmon and they catch an octopus or some other animal, that would be considered bycatch. And scientists agree that at current exploitation levels, that many important fish stocks will be removed from the system within 25 years. And lastly, there's a massive fossil fuel cost associated with wild caught fish, both in the fishing itself and then the transportation of the fish, that import exportation associated with processing that I mentioned before. So basically, resources from the ocean can have negative impacts on our environment and challenges to sustainability as well. So I wanted to try and see what research there was out on this. So after a little bit of digging, I found a paper entitled Chemical Characterization of Commercial Organic Fertilizers by Kurt Moeller that was published in 2015 in the Archives of Agronomy and Soil Science. In this paper, the authors talk about how there are a wide range of commercial organic fertilizers, but not a lot of research as to how heavy metals, organic pollutants like forever chemicals, PCBs, pesticides, and antibiotic residues persist in these fertilizers, and how much variation you might see in these fertilizers. And it took me a while to track down this paper as it wasn't easily accessible online, but it did appear to address some of the original idea of whether or not these fertilizers are safe or should be avoided for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So what they did was they took a collection of 77 total fertilizer samples across a range of products ranging from feather meal, bone meal, cocoa shells, clover grass pellets, flax meal, corn gluten-based fertilizers, and many more. You can see the list here. They analyzed the material on a wide variety of parameters, ranging from pH, EC, salt content, organic matter percentage, NPK, trace minerals, along with heavy metals, pesticides, antibiotics, GMOs, and PCBs, those forever chemicals. Here's some of what they found, and feel free to pause it if you want to go back and look at the data. But depending on the product, they essentially found varying levels of heavy metals based on the product source. Basically, all the fertilizers had some levels of heavy metals, though many were below the detection limits of the equipment used in the study. And here's some more of that information relating to organic persistent pollutant content and the number of positive tests for salmonella and pesticides in these fertilizers. So I wanted to highlight some of the author's comments and notes in the study as they're related to the safety of these different fertilizers. And here they state the concentration of persistent organic pollutants was close to the detection limit on a very low level for all sampled fertilizers. So basically, all the fertilizers had very, very low levels of these PCBs. So there wasn't a big difference between whether they were plant-based or meat-based, but they were low across the board. So that's a relatively good sign in saying that from a perspective of PCBs, pretty much all these fertilizers were safe. Antibiotic compounds were not found, and all the samples were GMO-free. I think this is an important statement because some of the argument I'm hearing against using some of these fertilizers is that they're going to be tainted with antibiotics and GMOs. And that just simply wasn't the case in this study based on all the samples that they took of, specifically the blood meal and the bone meal. And only some residues of few pesticides were found in the few wastes of the food processing industry, including the malt culms residues of the corn, maize processing, grape pomace, cocoa shells, and potato peels. So the only fertilizers that had any pesticide residue were actually the plant-based ones, which makes sense. So pesticides is not a concern with the bone meal or blood meal as well. Here's another section that I thought was really interesting. So the toxic element contents of most sampled commercial organic fertilizers were low compared to values found for source-separated organic urban waste compost or digestates, poultry manure, or other livestock manures. So essentially what they're saying here is that all these organic fertilizers are much lower in heavy metals compared to your compost source. Specifically, they single out poultry manure or other livestock manures down below, but essentially most of these animal-based composts are probably a much greater risk for bringing in all of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this talk than your fertilizer. However, there were some exceptions. There was high cadmium content in the waste of the maize corn processing, probably related to the high cadmium contents in the soil. So for any plant-based fertilizer, if that plant has the ability to take up those heavy metals and there's heavy metals in the soil that it's grown in, it could potentially be contaminated. And that's something to consider as well. But there wasn't high cadmium content in the bone meal or the blood meal or any of the meat-based one. Now, there was high lead content in horn and hooves, which could be related to contamination during the product drying process using open fires in the source countries. So the way that the authors suspect that the way that that product, the horn and hooves product, was processed is actually what's leading to the high lead, not necessarily the initial parent material that was used to make it the horns and hooves themselves. And the high toxic element and micronutrient contents in the potato peel-based fertilizer might be related to higher concentration of these elements in the potato skin and the nutrient grading of these elements from the periphery towards the center of the tuber. So the idea here being that the skin of the potato contained higher levels or higher concentrations of toxic elements, so in this case, heavy metals or micronutrients, than the actual flesh of the potato, as well as potentially some soil residues adhering to the skin of the potatoes from processing if that soil had higher levels of micronutrients or heavy metals. And then the low micronutrient content in animal fertilizers derived from slaughterhouse activities was likewise noteworthy. So they tend to be primarily just containing those macronutrients listed above. They don't have a lot of micronutrient content, which is fine because that's something that we can always pick up another way. So the measured contamination of the sampled commercial organic fertilizers with organic pollutants was several orders of magnitude lower than the values reported for organic urban waste composts. Again, I just want to highlight it. The compost is probably a much bigger risk and source of contamination in your garden than any of these commercial fertilizers. They also state that the lack of any contamination with antibiotic compounds in fertilizers derived from animal slaughterhouses is surprising, as application of antibiotic compounds has often become a applied procedure in conventional animal husbandry in the last decades. So they're saying, yes, they recognize the fact that many of these animals were probably treated with antibiotics, but they were not finding any actual antibiotic compounds in the feather meal, fish or feather meal, bone meal, blood meal, the ones associated with this study. However, only the minor ratio of the supplied antibiotic compounds is adsorbed by the animals. 40 to 90% is excreted by animal feces. Therefore, the highest pollution risk with antibiotic residues can be expected in livestock manures, as confirmed by several studies. So this makes total sense. This idea that antibiotics are ending up in your blood meal or bone meal it doesn't seem to be the case. Really, those things are moving through the animal systems, just like with humans, and ending up in the waste products. So it's really this poultry manure compost, or maybe poultry manure fertilizer, as well as cow manure, horse manure, where you'd want to be more concerned with antibiotics, and you may want to look for an organic source, input source, to avoid antibiotic contamination. And now contamination with pesticide residues was only found in waste with a low level of processing, like the grape, the malt, and the cocoa shells. And many of the compounds found are used during the storage of feedstock materials. So they may have been treated with insecticides while they were being stored. And many of the detected residues of insecticides belong to pyrethroids, and they list below, and some even a fungicide in the case of the grape pomace. So again, these plant-based fertilizers were more likely to have pesticide or fungicidal contamination. There was none found in any of the meat-based products. And most of the commercial organic fertilizers were derived from a very complex industrial processes, including heating and drying at the end of the processes. Essentially, this leads to de facto pasteurization. So this pasteurization is going to kill off Salmonella, E. coli, and a lot of these pathogens, as very few are able to survive the pasteurization process. And so then they state, therefore, the hygienic status of most of the commercial organic fertilizers derived from these complex processes in the food industry can be assessed as high. There was one sample of bone meal that tested positive for Salmonella, probably resulting from a reinfection after the heat treatment. So there may have been something in that particular process that allowed there to be potentially indicator bacteria for Salmonella in it. Now, what about mad cow's disease? This is another thing I've heard associated with risks with using bone meal. And I would state that with any organic fertilizer that we're putting out, one should use proper PPE. And in the case of things that are dusty, like even alfalfa meal, for example, you should wear a mask or respirator to prevent this stuff from getting into your lungs. Especially so, though, with these animal-based ones, because there are things called prions, which are resistant to heat and normal sterilization processes that can make it through this whole process that we just talked about. And there were 4 deaths in Great Britain in the mid 90s from using bone meal from cattle that had mad cow's disease. But they banned in 1997, the FDA banned using protein made from ruminants like cows, fed to other ruminants like pigs. And the primary source is in commercial feed of cattle from an infectious source. Now, one thing I learned that I wasn't aware of is that mad cow's disease occurs spontaneously at very low levels in all cattle populations, but only 5 cases have ever been discovered and reported in the United States, ever. So it's happening at a very low level, and it's a very low risk. So I would think that eating meat in a lot of cases, if you're eating anything that can potentially contain brain or spinal cord tissue, that's a much higher risk than using bone meal in your product. But I just did want to address that because it is something that people bring up as a potential risk. But in terms of the risk level of it, I just want to state that it appears to be fairly low. So what about blood meal? This was another interesting one because I saw on a website from a popular company stating that blood meal is full of antibiotics and pathogens. And so I wanted to research this because that to me is pretty scary and I don't want to use anything like that. So I wasted a good morning one day before the summit trying to find anything on Google Scholar that related to blood meal containing pathogens, containing antibiotics, or anything about blood meal as a fertilizer that might relate to this. And I was unable to find any research to support these claims. In fact, it was only listed on this one website, which I think it's been subsequently removed now, and one other website that used it as a citation to spread this message. And this was, I show you here one of the 2 websites I mentioned. So what I want to say is there's no research that I've been able to find to support this claim, and it would go directly against the study that I mentioned in this talk. And manure-based compost and commercial organic fertilizers may be way more problematic than your blood meal. One paper I found showed that repeated applications of chicken or swine, pig-based manure fertilizers increased antibiotic levels in soils, but then most of it dissipated over the course of a couple months, but not completely. So even worst case, you are getting antibiotics. They're not persisting terribly long in the soil, which I thought was interesting enough to share. These antibiotics are poorly absorbed and metabolized, so much of it is excreted in the waste of animals and humans. And there's very little research on the impact of veterinary antibiotics on soil ecosystems, unfortunately. So what if we want to avoid animals or fish altogether or look into alternative options than the ones I've already mentioned? What about neem then? Well, neem has a massive fossil fuel cost relative to other products. We're shipping it all the way from India. It has the potential for heavy metals and pesticide residues, even on organic products. I've mentioned this before on the podcast and other talks where my friend Suzanne Wainwright Evans had worked with a farm who had failed for a chemistry of pesticides that's no longer allowed for use in the United States and hasn't been allowed since the 70s. And they tracked it down after their cannabis crop failing, unfortunately. They tracked it down to the neem oil product they were using. And so essentially that neem seed meal had been crushed, the oil had been extracted, and there was enough residue of pesticides that had been sprayed onto that neem tree that it made it into the oil and then contaminated the product. So Basically, the point here is neem is not a perfect option or solution either. So what about soft rock phosphates? Well, it's a mined product, so it's going to contain heavy metals. There's really no way around that. And it has large fossil fuel costs, not only the mining process itself, but the transportation of the product. So, there may be mines that are cleaner in other countries outside of North America, but the cost to get that product here is a massive fossil fuel cost that one should account for when considering what products they want to use in their garden if you want to be ecological and sustainable. Same goes for guanos. They work, but large fossil fuel costs associated with them. They're harvested overseas. They damage the local ecology with that harvesting in many cases, and they're not sustainable. So, what are more sustainable options or alternatives? How about alfalfa meal? Alfalfa meal has massive water requirements. Now, don't get me wrong, I love alfalfa meal. It's something that I use in almost every garden prescription that I make. But it has a relatively low NPK. It requires a lot of water to grow it. It is a wonderful microbial source, but it's not perfect. And I guess that's the point I really want to make. So if we want to talk about, sustainability, then we really have to look at reducing our carbon footprint and our inputs. This means learning to cultivate with fewer inputs and not falling for the marketing around hype products or things in the bottles that we may really not need. And so if we want to talk about sustainability, insect frass to me is really one of the most sustainable nutrient sources available on the market today. Unfortunately, though, it does have limited sources and it has variable quality. But it is the most sustainable option for closing a loop in our food supply because we can feed our food waste to these insects. They can process it, and then their manure tends to be very clean. It tends to be contain good microbial activity and biomass, and it tends to be a pretty good product. Well, what about compost and manures? Those are also a great option. However, they can contain plastics, antibiotics, pesticides, and pathogens. So really, if we want to talk about if we want to look at what's organic and what's fake organic, truly our composts and manures have much more risk associated with them and much more contamination associated with them. And I think that's just something that we need to recognize when we're making a decision in our garden. And I say this as someone who loves compost, highly advocates for compost. We just need to be careful with it and not demonize certain products over other products based on an agenda that may or may not be accurate. Compost is probably going to contain heavy metals, so we need to use it sparingly if we're in a regulated state, or if the compost inputs contain heavy metals. And ultimately, where we land is trying to source things locally. And so even folks that purchase soil from us that we ship to them, we then try to work with them to use the fewest number of inputs as possible in order to grow healthy products and to try and source things as much as they can locally. Now, the limitations with locally sourcing things is limited options. You may not be able to get all of the products you want or clean versions of those products locally. And that's just the reality of the situation. And that may lead you to having to purchase some things online and have them shipped to you. But the best thing that we can do is reuse our soil and reduce our inputs while maintaining fertility. And the point of this whole talk is really not to say that like one input is better than another. I'm not here to say that blood meal or bone meal or feather meal are superior to fish bone meal or fish meal or other sources. I could have made the same talk around mine products like rock dust or peat moss versus coco coir, or just about any other input in our garden. I wanted to put together this talk as a way of encouraging growers to think critically and separate out a marketing message from reality. A lot of times, these messages are crafted to sell you products by allowing a company to differentiate themselves around the message. And sometimes these messages or concepts can be really powerful because they tug on our emotions or fit with our values. But when you dig just a little bit deeper, the reality of it can be entirely different. So in closing, I want to challenge you to think critically and deeply about how you cultivate this plant. Be open-minded to new ideas, but also do your own research and don't accept anything that you hear at face value, regardless of how authoritative or knowledgeable this person may be or how many followers they may have on social media. So whether you practice Jadam or KNF or biodynamics or soil food web, at the end of the day, there's wisdom and misinformation in every one of these methods. It wasn't until my good friend Tim Wilson called me out about some things that I was saying about compost tea that I had heard from the foremost expert in the industry and challenged me to test it out for myself that I became a more critical thinker, and it made me a better grower. You can always trial new ideas or products in a test plot in your garden too if you make a hypothesis and take a scientific approach. At the end of the day, though, regardless of what method you use or what amendments you choose to use in your garden, there's a million ways to grow this plant. And as long as you're being thoughtful and with an eye towards sustainability, then it's all good in my book. Thanks for checking out this talk. Please reach out if you have any questions. I really appreciate it.